guys, and welcome to the second of our Holy Week devotionals. Looking through the story of Holy Week. Hope you guys are all doing well out there. So today we're going to move on from Palm Sunday, where we left Jesus. He'd had the march procession into Jerusalem on the donkey, and then had a look at the temple and gone home back to Bethany, where he was staying just outside the city. And it kind of, when you read that bit, it looks a little bit kind of anticlimactic, I guess is probably the best word, that you've got this big arrival, this announcement that I am here and I am king, and he just kind of fades out again. I definitely had that feeling when I was reading it until I came to what happened the next day. Now, the exact day that everything happened during this week, it depends which of the Gospels you read. So I'm going to be taking kind of a best guess, I guess is the way of putting it, based on the book I mentioned yesterday, The Longest Week by Nick Page. So Monday morning, we've got Jesus in Bethany, and he's heading out back to Jerusalem. And on the road, he's there with his disciples, and there's a fig tree which is flowering. Now, fig trees actually produce fruit twice a year, but this is not a time when fruit would be produced, and it even says that in the Bible. It says that it wasn't the season for fruit. Well, Jesus goes up to there because he's hungry and looks for something to eat, and he sees that the tree doesn't have anything on it. There's no fruit on the tree at all, which is not very surprising, really. I don't know what else Jesus would have expected, but what he does, he turns around and he curses the tree, which is one of the weirdest bits in the whole of the Gospels, that, as far as I'm concerned, that Jesus has sort of gone up to this tree and just decided that because it doesn't have fruit for him, he's going to curse it. But being Jesus, nothing is accidental. There's a demonstration. This is not about figs. This is not about trees. This has a bigger message. And then the story cuts on from there. And we don't get the climax, and we won't get the climax until tomorrow, because Mark does what's often known as a Markan sandwich, where he splits a story into two parts and then puts in the middle something which the outer parts relate to, if that makes sense. So he's taken the first part of the fig tree story, and then tomorrow we'll look at the final part, the second part, and what happens in between. We can assume that the outer part, that the story of the fig tree, is relating to that in some way. It's saying something about that, commenting on it. But what happened next? Well, Jesus goes back into Jerusalem, and yesterday we covered a bit about how Jerusalem was a city of two halves, the upper and lower cities. So you had the rich people who had fairly nice places to live, and the poor who were crammed in basically slums. This was squalor. But then you really have a third part of the city, which is the temple. Now, the temple itself was magnificent. It had been lined in white stones. It would have glinted in the sun. And it was massive. It took up the whole of the Temple Mount, this sort of ridge. It had actually been extended by Herod the Great, who'd been king. Yes, that Herod. From the Christmas story. He'd extended it and built up retaining walls, one of which still survives today. Is the only part of the temple complex still to survive. And he's built this massive complex as a centre for Jewish worship. And to get to it, there are a few different ways in, but there was no one big processional route. So there were a lot of little alleyways, and you would be going up steps because it's very high up. There were tunnels even through the Temple Mount leading upwards that would let you into the courtyard. We don't know how Jesus got in, but it must have been a real sort of shock coming from the darkness and the squalor and the filth of the lower city to the beautiful cleanliness of the temple. This area would have been kept as spotless as they could, except for the animal blood that would have been splashed on the altar. They want to keep this clean and pure because this is all building up to the very centre, the Holy of Holies, where they believe God's presence dwelt with them. But when you first get there, you're into the outer court, which is called the Court of the Gentiles. Now, the Gentiles basically is people who aren't Jewish. So pretty much anyone can go there, as long as you're not unclean. Then you can enter this area, and this is where you would have had the traders' stalls, money changers, which we'll be coming on to quite dramatically in a little bit. People would sell animals, and that would be for sacrifices. You'd then go round, there'd be a further gate into the court of the women, and that is as far as women could go. So you have to be Jewish, but if you're Jewish, either you're a man or woman, you can get into the court of the women, which is a smaller area. There's another gate beyond that, which is to the court of the Israelites, and that only allows ritually clean Jewish men. So it's kind of getting narrower and narrower who's allowed in, and this whole system where the gates were placed, the route you had to take, was designed almost to filter people down. Normally in a temple of that time, in other religions, you'd have this big focus on getting everyone to the altar. Well, no, in the Jewish temple it was much harder to get there. And so in the court of the Israelites you'd have just the men, and there'd be a low wall, and beyond that is the court of the priests. At that point, only priests are allowed in there. And that is where the altar is. So that's where the animals, lambs would be quite common, birds of various kinds, chickens or pigeons, doves, and they would be sacrificed, they'd be killed, the blood splashed on the altar. And during a festival, especially like Passover, there would be a non-stop stream of pilgrims with animals to sacrifice. Animals were sacrificed for just about anything. Beginning and end of every day, there'd be Thanksgiving sacrifices. If you were cured, if you wanted to become clean again, having been unclean, then you would have to make a sacrifice. When you've had a child, the woman had to present a sacrifice to be made clean after childbirth. All these rules. And so you've got all this work going on, and then behind that you've got the temple building itself. And there'll be a very heavy curtain on the outer door. Now, this curtain's mentioned again later in the story, so we'll talk about that. But during festival times, it seems to have mostly been held open so people could just get a glimpse beyond. Not that you could see much, but if you went in there, as you get further in, you get to the Holy of Holies, a cube-shaped room right in the heart where the Ark of the Covenant was resting. Now, this Ark of the Covenant is what was made by the Israelites in the wilderness. So, it was said to have the Ten Commandments in it, and some manna, and Aaron's staff. So this dates way back to the time of Moses, and that was in the Holy of Holies. Now that could only be entered by the high priest, and even then only once a year. So it's narrowing down until you get to the Holy of Holies, where God himself was dwelling. But Jesus isn't in, well, he's not in the Holy of Holies, he's not even in the court of the Israelites or the court of the women. He's in the court of the Gentiles, the very outer courtyard, which is pretty open to anyone. And he goes in there where he's seeing all this trading going on. Now, that trade was not illegitimate in itself. People needed to change money. People needed to buy animals for sacrifice. If you've come from a long way away, your local money isn't good to pay the temple tax. This is a tax that was paid annually by Jews anywhere in the Roman world. They would pay this money, and it was valued. It was half a shekel, which was a fair amount of money in those days. But although these businesses were legitimate, these sort of trading was needed in this part of the temple. Jesus goes in and he causes havoc. He flips the tables over of the traders. So you can just imagine the poor traders. This is their livelihood. This is their busiest time of year, and Jesus knocks it all out. There's in one of the Gospels, he even braids like a whip together out of rope and whips, presumably animals, out. And so he's causing a bit of a ruckus. But what's he trying to do here? Because when we've looked at the story so far, everything Jesus does is deliberate and calculated. He's made the march in, remember, almost as a parody of Pilate, well, and Roman power. Well, what's he saying here? Well, the first thing to bear in mind is that he's not making a serious attempt to bring down the temple or to stop it from performing sacrifices. For one thing, the temple was almost an all-powerful institution in those days. There's no way that a small action like this would disrupt it. And in any case, if he was going to do that, you'd think he'd choose to be much further in, closer to where the priests were, to actually be able to disrupt the work. But he's out in the court of the Gentiles. Secondly, there's no reason for Jesus to have an issue with the individual traders. They are just going about work. But to understand properly what Jesus is doing, what I think we need to do is look at the greater way in which the temple was operating. So this was the economic powerhouse of Jerusalem. This is where the money was created, through people paying temple tax, paying for sacrifices. And I was sort of reading through Nick Page's book, and it strikes me how much he relates it to he relates it to the Hajj pilgrimage today, which is a pilgrimage that still goes on for Muslims, where Muslims will go to Mecca in Saudi Arabia and perform a pilgrimage. A lot of the same rituals that would have happened during Jewish festivals are there. They're not identical. They're separated by 2,000 years now, although Hajj dates nearly that as far back as Temple times. But what we see there is a problem with the economic system. Again, we touched on that yesterday a little bit. But you've got to consider that the temple has the power, and there was a saying that the temple always has the upper hand. What did that mean? Well, if, say, you were selling something to the temple, some kind of goods that was needed for the temple, and you agreed to supply it for 12 shekels, for example. So that's how much you're selling it for. If your price rose, you were not allowed to raise your price. However, if the cost to you fell, you had to also lower the price you were charging the temple. So the temple wins either way. If the price goes up, it still gets it at the same price, but if it goes down, it will benefit from that. In the same way, who's setting the prices of, say, the animals for sacrifice? Well, it would have been the priests. It would have been the temple. So these people, they're not setting their own prices necessarily, these sellers in the temple. It's kind of been decreed, and there were records of prices going up by 25 times at festival periods. So the price of these sacrifices that you needed to make in order to be part of this festival, in order to be pure, in order to be acceptable to God in the eyes of the Jewish leadership, well, they were taking advantage of the situation. It's like, the closest I can think of is during TT, when everything suddenly shoots up in price. It was exactly that. It was a captive audience who travelled a long way and needed what you were selling. More than that, the money changers. Well, why do we need those? Partly, local currency isn't good in Jerusalem necessarily, but actually, the temple authorities decreed that the tax must only be paid in a particular coin, the Tyrian shekel. Why do they pick that? Well, the temple tax had traditionally been paid in silver, had to be silver. But the Jews were not allowed to mint silver coins by the Romans. They could mint lower sort of types of coins, but not silver ones. So they had to pick something else. But the Roman coins were insulting to them. They included an image of the emperor, and that was considered idolatry. It's a graven image. It's not allowed within Judaism. So they picked the Tyrian shekel, which is one of the few coins at the time that didn't include the emperor. What it did include, however, was the local god in Tyre. So it would seem in some ways to be a worse situation, a worse suggestion, except that the Tyrian shekel contained a much higher percentage of silver content than other coins. coins. It was highly regulated. You would be looking at about 90% silver. So it was actually kind of worth more. It was the best coin. And this is what the temple wanted. So they picked this one coin as the only way you could pay it, so you needed to change your money. But it got worse. The cost per person was half a shekel. But the temple authorities didn't really like the half shekel coins. They wanted the 1 shekel coins. They had more silver in them. They were the really good coins. So what did they do? Well, if you wanted to pay with a half shekel, which is the correct amount, you actually had to pay an extra fee above your half shekel. They were trying to discourage people doing that and instead get them to buddy up with someone else and pay with 1 shekel, with 1 coin for the two of them. So they were taking advantage of people in that way as well. You couldn't just come with with the money from your homeland. You had to trade it so you got so that the temple would get the most value out of it. And if you wanted to pay what you were meant to pay, that wasn't good enough. You had to try and find someone to share with in order for the temple to get yet more money. So the whole system around these festivals was about driving money into Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't have a crop. It didn't have a money-making sort of ability except for the Jewish religion, except for how the temple generated money. And so records seem to show that they were doing everything they can to do it. So maybe that is why Jesus was quite so angry with the money changers and the traders in the temple. He says, as he's done, it says, "My house should be called a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of thieves." And the word for thieves there would be better rendered as bandits. These are highwaymen. These are people who are, attacking people out on the road. Think of the Samaritan. So he's making a real accusation against the temple authorities here that people are being taken advantage of and people are being excluded from worship. People who are barely existing can't afford the sacrifices they're meant to give. And the temple is opulent as well. It's not like it's short on cash. The high priest's robes, if we were to kind of put them into roughly how much they'd be worth today, it would be like wearing an outfit worth £400,000. Again, that's rough. The book is a little old, so the conversion rate might not quite be right. But imagine wearing something worth that much. And so this whole system is just generating money to the wealthy in society, helping them get richer. But there's one more twist in the tale. Some of the stalls in the temple were owned by the house of Hanan. Now, we can't read too much into this because it is a very common name. It would be not quite like, but a bit like if it was a House of Smith or the Isle of Man House of Quayle. It's a fairly common family name. But at the time it's notable that the high priest in charge was of the house of Ananus, which is another way of writing Hanan. So it seems possible, indeed potentially likely, that the person profiting off of all these sales wasn't just some random bloke off the street. It was the high priest himself. They had set themselves up so that the temple made all the money and was always benefiting, and they were always benefiting. And this corrupt system is what Jesus walks into, and he flips the tables over and he kind of says, "No more. This is not right." Well, what happens after that? Jesus leaves. He's not stopped. And that kind of tells us that this wasn't seen as a threat to the temple directly. This wasn't seen as an imminent threat because the temple guards don't arrest him. The Roman soldiers who are just over in the fortress just next to the temple, which even has a walkway to the temple because of how explosive the temple could be, they don't respond. It seems like it's mostly ignored, except for that in the Bible it tells us that at that point the chief priests start to decide on how they can kill Jesus. This seems to be a defining moment. Jesus isn't killed just because he turned over some tables, and he isn't killed it's hard to say exactly why he was put to death. He was ultimately, the charge was that he was calling himself King of the Jews, which was a challenge to the emperor. But in this case, what seems to spark this is not simply the turning over of tables, it is him demonstrating against the injustice. You'll probably comment the word that I'm meant to be using. How unjust the system in the temple was. It's him making a statement that this is not how it should be. And so as he leaves, the conversations are starting that will see him eventually arrested and crucified. And so that is where we leave it. He goes back to Bethany and stays there for the night again, where he's staying out of Jerusalem, out of the eye of the storm, where all these things are happening. Jesus is just a little bit removed at night. And tomorrow we'll pick up the story again. We'll pick up the story of the fig tree and look a little bit more at that, and some things Jesus says about the temple, things that end up being quoted at him in his trial. But for today, I wonder if you'd like to think a bit about Jesus here is standing up to something that is wrong. He sees the injustice of the system, and this is a religious system. These are people who at least claim to be following God, and Jesus says no. What things should we be standing up to in today's world? What are the injustices that are around us, that are in our institutions, in our churches, in our schools, in our homes, anything? What are the things that we need to be standing up and saying, enough? And I always like to remember that whenever anyone asks me what would Jesus do, flipping over a table is a potential answer. That's all for today. Please don't flip over any tables. Hope you all stay safe, and I'll be back tomorrow with a little bit more. See you.